The night my family cut me out, my brother said it like he was making a practical decision. "We won't need you at the closing tomorrow." He said it across my mother's dining table at 8:17 p.m. on a Thursday in early September. My mother kept folding and unfolding her napkin. My father stared at the budget worksheet in front of him like the numbers might arrange themselves into something cleaner if he avoided looking at me. My brother Daniel sat back in his chair with that calm, rehearsed confidence people use when they have already convinced themselves they are being reasonable. I remember reading the room once, then again. They had already decided before I arrived. I was 35 years old by then, old enough to know the difference between a discussion and a performance. This was a performance. They had invited me there to hear the final version, not to be part of it. I asked one question. Understood by whom? Daniel exhaled through his nose, like I was being difficult. By everyone involved. That silence told me more than his answer. I nodded, took a sip of water, and set the glass down carefully so my hand would not shake against the table. Then I said the only thing that made sense. Okay, not because I agreed, because I was done explaining my value to people who only recognized it when paperwork started failing. I stayed for another 4 minutes, long enough to gather the folder I had brought, long enough to hear my mother say, "Please don't make this into a big thing," and long enough to watch my father say nothing at all. Then I stood up, thanked her for dinner I had barely touched, and left. In the car, I did not cry. I opened the Notes app on my phone and documented the time. 8:24 p.m. Family informed me I was no longer needed for Friday closing. No written notice. No instruction regarding removal of my name from compliance submissions, lender correspondence, or document chain. Then I drove home. By 9:02 p.m., I had logged into my work laptop from my kitchen table. By 9:11 p.m., I had pulled every file in the shared family transaction folder into a private review queue. By 9:34 p.m., I had confirmed what I already suspected. My name was still attached to 8 active documents related to the property purchase they were so eager to finish without me. Not socially attached, legally, operationally, traceably. My name was listed as the compliance reviewer on the environmental disclosure package. My professional email was still copied on the lender clarification chain. My contact information appeared on the title deficiency response memo. One municipal affidavit still contained my certification block because Daniel had reused a prior template and never bothered removing it. That was when I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling clear. At 9:47 p.m., I drafted a written withdrawal notice. At 10:06 p.m., I sent it. The email went to my father, my brother, the real estate attorney handling the transaction, the title officer, and the outside broker Daniel had been using for 6 weeks while pretending he had everything under control. Subject line: formal withdrawal of review, representation, and document use authorization. The language was simple. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing from any advisory, documentation, review, or compliance-related role in connection with the Carson Ridge acquisition and all associated entities, communications, and filings. My name, credentials, contact information, and prior draft language may not be used, reproduced, or relied upon in any active or future transaction materials without my written consent. Any document currently bearing my name, initials, comments, or certifications must be revised and reissued before submission. I attached a list of affected files with timestamps. Then I turned my phone face down and made tea. That is the part people always expect to be dramatic. It wasn't. I did not send angry texts. I did not call anyone back. I did not threaten them. I just removed the structure they had mistaken for decoration. By the next morning, everything they had been hiding behind was visible. My name is Nina Mercer. I was 35 when this happened, and at the time I was a senior regulatory documentation manager for a regional healthcare network in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you are listening from somewhere else, tell me where you are watching from. And if you know what it feels like to be useful long before you are respected, comment one word: useful. I had spent most of my adult life becoming the person people called when something needed to be correct. Not exciting, not glamorous, correct. At work, that meant physician contracting files, state audit responses, Medicare enrollment corrections, licensure renewals, policy revision logs, and every kind of documentation problem that can become expensive when people treat details like personality issues. My job was not to make people feel organized. My job was to make sure records could survive scrutiny. I was good at it because I did not guess. I read every line. I tracked version history. I saved emails as PDFs when needed. I documented who requested what and when. I knew which phrases sounded harmless in conversation but became dangerous once attached to a signature line. I understood how one missing disclosure, one outdated attachment, one reused form with the wrong date could stall an approval for weeks. In my family, all of that was called Nina being intense, until they needed it. My father, Harold Mercer, built a reputation in our town as a practical man. He owned 2 small commercial buildings over the years, sold one, refinanced another, and turned those stories into a version of himself that sounded bigger every time he told it. He liked rooms where people wore blazers and said terms like portfolio and leverage with a straight face. Status mattered to him in a way he would never admit directly. He did not need to be the richest person in the room. He needed to be mistaken for one. My mother supported that image in quieter ways. She hosted people, remembered anniversaries, sent handwritten notes, and treated appearances like household maintenance. Daniel inherited the performance part from both of them. He was 3 years younger than me, outgoing, confident, and very good at sounding informed for about 7 minutes at a time. I was the one who stayed after everyone left and fixed what they had misstated. It started small, years before the property deal that finally broke the pattern. In 2018, my parents were trying to refinance a rental duplex outside Cary. My father called me on a Sunday evening and said he only needed a quick look at the package. That quick look became 3 hours of me correcting rent roll inconsistencies, missing insurance declarations, and a property tax figure that had been copied from the wrong parcel. He never thanked me. He just said, "See, this is why I told the lender my daughter handles documents." Handles documents? Like I sorted holiday cards? In 2019, Daniel started a home renovation partnership with a friend from college. The friend disappeared after 6 months, leaving unpaid vendor invoices and a mess of unsigned change orders. Daniel showed up at my apartment with a banker's box and a coffee he forgot I don't drink. He said, "I know this is your weird thing. Can you put it in order so I know what I'm looking at?" My weird thing. I spent 2 weekends building him a file index, invoice log, contractor correspondence sheet, and reconciliation summary. He used it to negotiate down 3 claims and avoid 1 lawsuit threat. At a family barbecue a month later, my father introduced Daniel as the one with the head for business. I was standing next to the cooler holding a tray of cut fruit. In 2020, when my mother's cousin challenged the terms of a family estate transfer in Tennessee, who read the closing packet and caught the deed exhibit mismatch before filing? Me. In 2021, when Daniel nearly signed a personal guarantee he did not understand on a warehouse sublease, who marked the liability language in red and made him send it back? Me. In 2022, when my father wanted to buy into a small assisted living property with 2 outside investors, who built the due diligence checklist, organized the licensing questions, tracked the inspection deficiencies, and explained to him 3 separate times that occupancy and licensure capacity were not interchangeable numbers? Me. Publicly, though, I was still careful Nina, paperwork Nina, our in-house worrier. I heard every version of it. At Easter one year, Daniel told his girlfriend I worked in administrative stuff at a hospital company. At Thanksgiving, my father said, in front of 12 people, "Nina always thinks the form matters more than the deal." I let him finish before answering. Then I said, "The form is what decides whether you still have a deal in 60 days. He laughed like I had made a clever little joke. But later that same night, after everyone left, he followed me into the kitchen with a stack of unsigned occupancy disclosures and asked if I could clean them up before morning. That was the rhythm of my place in the family: dismissal in public, dependence in private. No one said thank you in a way that acknowledged the weight of what I was protecting. They only relaxed when I was doing it. By the time we got to Carson Ridge, I should have known better than to get involved. Carson Ridge was supposed to be Daniel's big step into serious real estate. That is how he described it in January, when he called me during my lunch break and said he had found a 15-unit mixed-use property outside Winston-Salem with a ground-floor pharmacy lease, upper-floor offices, and upside. I asked the usual questions. Who owns it now? Is the lease assignment clean? Any code enforcement history? Environmental flags? Pending roof claims? Title defects? He laughed and said, "This is why I called you first." Not because he respected the questions, because he knew I would ask the ones nobody else wanted to think about until too late. The purchase price was listed at $2.86 million. Daniel was contributing less cash than he implied to most people. My father was putting in part of the equity through a line of credit secured against his remaining building. There was also a private investor from Charlotte and a short-term bridge component that made me uneasy the first time I saw the structure. Too many moving parts, not enough disciplined people, and no one except me treating the document trail like it mattered. I told them from the beginning I would not be part of the ownership entity. I would not sign as an officer, member, or guarantor. I would review documents, flag issues, and help them keep the file clean. That was all. My father said, "Of course, no one's asking for more than that." That sentence aged badly. Over the next 4 months, Carson Ridge slowly became a second job I was not paid for and could not openly resent without being called cold. There were zoning clarifications with conflicting parcel descriptions. A tenant estoppel certificate came back incomplete. The pharmacy lease amendment referenced an addendum no one could locate. 2 repair escrows were verbally promised but not clearly documented. The title company kept requesting updated entity information because Daniel submitted inconsistent versions of the buyer structure. The lender wanted source of funds letters phrased properly, and my father kept drafting his own versions that sounded vague and defensive. I corrected all of it. At 6:42 a.m. before work, at 11:15 p.m. after dinner, on Sundays, in parking lots, in the waiting room during my aunt's cataract surgery, on one memorable Tuesday at 8:03 p.m. I sat in my car outside a grocery store dictating a revised disclosure summary because Daniel said the broker needed it tonight, and he had already told everyone I was on it. He always told people I was on it before asking whether I was. That was the real problem, although I did not fully name it until later. They were not asking for help anymore. They were using access. And somewhere along the way, Daniel started behaving as if my caution was an obstacle instead of the only reason the transaction still had shape. The week before they cut me out, I flagged 2 problems in writing. The first was a discrepancy between the seller's repair credit representation and the title side settlement draft. The second was a certification page containing my name in a context I had not approved. I sent both issues by email on Tuesday, August 31st at 7:18 p.m. with the note, "These items must be corrected before closing. Do not circulate materials bearing my name unless I have reviewed final form." Daniel called me 12 minutes later and said I was slowing everyone down. I documented that, too. At the time, I still thought the story was about a property deal. I still thought the injury was being underestimated, talked over, treated as too serious, the way it always had been. I did not yet understand that my family's real habit was much older than Carson Ridge. They believed my standards belonged to them once they had benefited from them long enough. And when I finally stopped letting them borrow those standards under my name, they called that disloyalty. That Thursday night in September was just the first time they said it out loud. When Daniel told me I would not be needed at the closing, he expected me to either argue or fold. Those were the roles available to me in the family system: difficult or useful, emotional or helpful. He did not know what to do with neutral. Neither did my parents, so I gave them neutral. I went home. I put everything in writing. And before the sun came up, the first reply hit my inbox from the title officer at 6:13 a.m. It began, "Thank you for the clarification. We were not aware your authorization had been withdrawn. We will need immediate instruction from the purchasing entity before proceeding." That was the first crack. There would be many more after that. By 6:40 a.m., there were 4 more emails. The attorney handling the transaction wanted confirmation that my withdrawal applied to all prior draft language or only to pending materials. The broker wanted to know whether the lender had been copied. Daniel sent a 2-line message that read, "This is unnecessary. We are under deadline. Call me now." My father sent nothing. That told me more than anything else that morning. When he believed he could still control a situation privately, he preferred silence first. He would wait, let other people absorb the shock, then arrive later with some version of reasonableness. He had done that my whole life. My mother would make the emotional appeal. Daniel would make the irritated one. My father would come in at the end sounding calm, practical, disappointed, as if everyone else had forced him into a role he did not want. I had seen the pattern enough times to stop being surprised by it. At 6:52 a.m., I replied to the attorney and copied the same group. My withdrawal applies to all pending and future use of my name, review comments, certifications, document language, and advisory role, unless expressly reauthorized by me in writing. Prior drafts containing my input may not be represented as approved final documents. Please remove all references to me from active closing materials. Then I closed my laptop, got dressed for work, and drove to the office. That is another part people tend to misunderstand when I tell this story. My withdrawal from them was not emotional chaos. It was procedure. I still had a job. I still had meetings. I still had my own files to manage. I arrived at the healthcare network office at 8:03 a.m., badge in one hand, coffee in the other, and sat through a payer audit prep meeting from 8:30 to 9:15 while my phone buzzed 5 times in my bag. I did not look at it until the meeting ended. There were 3 missed calls from Daniel, 1 from my mother, and 1 from a number I recognized as the outside broker. I documented the times. Then I called the broker back from an empty conference room. His name was Greg Halpern, mid-50s, polished, always 1 degree more casual than the room, so he could seem relaxed while still controlling the pace. He spoke quickly when things were going well, and very slowly when he wanted someone else to feel responsible. He picked up on the first ring. "Nina, good, thank you. I'm trying to understand why we've had a procedural disruption at the 11th hour." I remember looking at the blinds on the conference room window while he said it. Procedural disruption. As if my name had floated accidentally into a stack of forms and not been used repeatedly because everyone assumed I would clean up whatever needed cleaning. "It isn't a disruption," I said. "It's a withdrawal. There's a difference." He paused, then shifted into that broker tone people use when they think women can be nudged into being agreeable if the voice is smooth enough. "This deal has multiple parties relying on momentum. So did every deadline I addressed for the last 4 months." Another pause. Then he tried something more direct. "Daniel said you were helping as family." "I was," I said. "I am not anymore, and I am certainly not authorizing use of my professional identity after being told I was no longer needed." That silence told me he knew exactly how bad the phrasing was on their side. He lowered his voice. "Just so I am clear, was your name still being used in circulated documents after you were excluded from the closing?" I wrote the time down while he spoke, 9:22 a.m. Yes, I said, that is exactly what I am saying. He exhaled, and when he spoke again, he sounded less polished and more alert. I'll need to review what went out. You should, I said. And Greg, I want this noted accurately. I did not withdraw from an ownership role. I never had one. I withdrew permission for my name, document language, review history, and compliance-related input to be used or represented as active support. I understand. I let him finish before answering. No, I said. I don't think you did until this morning. Then I ended the call. At 9:31 a.m., Daniel sent a message that just said, "Are you trying to blow this up?" I answered in writing, "No, I am removing myself from something you told me I was not part of." He did not reply for almost an hour. That hour gave me enough quiet to think clearly about how we got there. People always talk about family exploitation like it begins with one dramatic betrayal. In my experience, it starts with convenience and repetition. It starts when one person in a family becomes known for being competent, calm, and unlikely to create a scene. Everyone tells themselves they are only asking for one small thing, then another, then another. Over time, the requests stop sounding like requests because the system has reorganized itself around that person's reliability. That person was me. I became the family fixer by temperament first, then by training. I was the oldest child. I liked clarity. I liked instructions that made sense. I liked being able to find a mistake before it became expensive. In school, I was the one teachers trusted with forms. In college, I worked in the registrar's office part-time and learned very early that most crises people call sudden are actually paperwork problems that have been politely ignored for weeks. After graduation, I started in provider enrollment for a medical group in Durham. It was not glamorous work, but it was exacting. One wrong taxonomy code, one missed licensure update, one unsigned reassignment form, and reimbursements could stall for months. I learned how institutions protect themselves, how signatures travel, how credentialing files tell stories, even when people think they are just administrative bundles. By my early 30s, I was managing documentation systems across several clinics and hospital partnerships. My team tracked physician files, contract amendments, insurance attestations, audit requests, and regulatory responses. I knew what language could bind someone to a process they had not agreed to. I knew how easily names are borrowed when people think competence is a background utility. My family never understood my title, but they understood the result. Problems stopped bleeding when I touched them. That made me valuable in all the wrong ways. There was a phrase my mother liked to use whenever she wanted me to do something tedious or urgent for the family. "You're just so much better at this than the rest of us." It sounded like praise. It was usually deployment. In March of the year before Carson Ridge, my parents were trying to help Daniel secure interim financing on a smaller office condo conversion. The lender requested updated personal financial statements, evidence of reserve liquidity, and clarification on a prior lien release. Daniel sent me photographs of half-completed forms taken on his kitchen counter under poor lighting and asked if I could make it presentable. I told him presentable was not the same as accurate. He said, "You know what I mean." I spent 3 evenings rebuilding the packet from scratch because the numbers on the statement did not align with the bank balances, and one asset had been listed twice under slightly different descriptions. I sent back a clean version with notes explaining what still required direct confirmation from him. 2 days later, my mother called and said, "Your brother says you overwhelmed him." I remember standing in the produce section at Harris Teeter holding a bag of lemons while she said that. "I overwhelmed him?" I repeated. "With too many notes, he gets discouraged." "That is not my problem," I said. She sighed like I had missed the point. "No, sweetheart, but you know how he is. You're the one who can make things simple." That was the role. Not the expert, not the professional, the simplifier. The one who takes risk, vagueness, missing information, and other people's carelessness and converts it into something they can survive without feeling embarrassed. I did it for years because some part of me thought usefulness could become belonging if I kept doing it well enough. I know better now. Around 11:10 a.m. that Friday, my father finally called. I let it ring twice before answering, not to punish him, but to steady myself. His tone was exactly what I expected. Calm, controlled, not apologetic. Nina, Dad, what are we doing here? I wrote the time, 11:12 a.m. We are documenting the fact that I was removed from the closing while my name remained on transaction materials. That is a very loaded way to put it. It is an accurate way to put it. He was quiet for a second. I could picture him standing in his study with one hand on his hip, looking at papers he did not fully understand, and resenting the papers for requiring him to. This did not need to become formal. I agree, I said. It should have stayed respectful. He ignored that. Your brother was trying to reduce tension. He felt you were creating unnecessary complications right before closing. I sat down at the conference table because I knew if I stayed standing, I might start pacing. I identified errors. That is not the same thing. Sometimes, he said, people have to decide what matters most. I read that sentence once in my head, then again. There it was, the family logic in one line. Harmony over accuracy. Image over record. Deadline over traceability. Feelings over consequences. Right until consequences arrived and suddenly my precision became indispensable again. What matters most, I said carefully, is whether my name was being used after I was told I was not needed. He did not answer directly. We were close to the finish line. That is not an answer. Another pause. Then he said, Do you really want to derail your brother over wording? That sentence changed something in me, not because it was cruel, because it was honest. Wording. That was what he thought my work was. Not liability management, not document control, not safeguarding representations that could carry legal and financial consequences. Wording. Decorative seriousness. Optional caution. I let him finish before answering. I am not derailing him, I said. I am refusing to cover him. He got quieter at that. You're making this sound ugly. No, I said. I am making it visible. He ended the call 3 minutes later with, We'll speak tonight. We did not. At 11:47 a.m. The attorney sent a group email confirming the closing could not proceed as scheduled until revised documents were issued and the title file rebalanced to remove unauthorized references. The lender, now alerted, requested clarification on who had prepared and approved the compliance-related narrative attached to the source of funds explanation. Greg the broker suddenly sounded much less smooth in his next voicemail. My mother sent a text saying simply, Please call me before this goes any further. By then, it had already gone further. And the reason it had gone further was not just that I withdrew. It was that my withdrawal exposed how much of the transaction's credibility had been leaning on me without being openly acknowledged. That afternoon, I had my regular one-on-one with my director at work. Her name was Celeste Warren. She was the closest thing I had to a mentor then, and one of the only people in my life who understood the difference between being detail-oriented and being structurally responsible. She took one look at my face when I stepped into her office and said, You're holding something very steady right now. I smiled despite myself. That obvious? To anyone who has ever had their name used beyond scope? I sat down and told her the short version. Not every family detail, just the essential facts. Property deal, repeated unpaid review work, public dismissal, ongoing document usage, written withdrawal, immediate fallout. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. You know what this is, right? I think so. Say it anyway. I looked at the legal pad on her desk because it was easier than looking at her. They normalized using my professional credibility as family property. She nodded once. Yes, and when you converted it back into consent, they called you difficult. That silence told me more than any voicemail I had gotten all day. Celeste asked one more question. Did you preserve the document trail? Yes. All of it? Yes. Good, she said. Then don't argue with anyone by phone unless you need specific admissions. Writing only where possible. Clean language, no emotion. No defending your character. I laughed softly. You make that sound like a treatment plan. In some families, she said, it is. I went back to my desk and did exactly that. From 2 p.m. onward, I responded in writing only. To my mother, I am available by email. To Daniel, I will not discuss this by phone. Put your questions in writing. To the attorney, thank you. Please confirm revised distribution once all references to me are removed. To Greg, please preserve all circulated versions containing my name and identify recipients of those versions. At 3:16 p.m. Daniel finally sent the first real email. It was 3 paragraphs of blame, written in the voice he uses when he wants to sound formal without actually saying anything precise. He accused me of overreacting, embarrassing the family, misunderstanding the urgency of commercial transactions, and creating avoidable costs. He said I had always had a tendency to escalate procedural issues beyond their practical significance. I read it once, then again. Then I replied with 5 lines. For the record, I was informed on September 9th at 8:17 p.m. that I was no longer needed at closing. As of 9:34 p.m., my name remained on multiple active transaction documents. I had not approved final versions of those materials. Unauthorized use of my name and prior review language is not a procedural preference. It is a material issue. Please answer directly. After I was excluded from the closing, did you instruct any party to remove my name before revised documents were requested this morning? He did not answer the question. That told me enough. By late afternoon, what had looked to my family like my private overreaction had become a documented problem involving the title company, attorney, broker, and lender. Not because I made noise, because I stopped absorbing theirs. At 5:42 p.m., my mother left a voicemail that was somehow both tearful and strategic. Nina, I really think you are missing what this is doing to your father. He is humiliated. People are asking questions. This could affect relationships we've had for years. I need you to think bigger than the paperwork. I saved the voicemail because that was the sentence. Bigger than the paperwork, as if records are small, as if signatures are petty, as if the systems that move money, transfer liability, define consent, and protect reputations are just annoying obstacles for emotional people to manage. Paperwork was never the small thing in our family. Paperwork was where the truth kept surviving after the storytelling changed. And by the end of that Friday, for the first time in my life, the truth was no longer being quietly handled in the background by me. It was sitting in everyone's inbox with timestamps on it. By Monday morning, they had stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. The language changed first. That is usually how you know a family system is under strain. The softer words disappear. Concern becomes inconvenience. Disappointment becomes accusation. Love becomes access with better branding. At 7:08 a.m., my mother sent an email with the subject line, "Please be reasonable." It was not long. She said the closing delay had created a damaging impression with outside parties. She said my father had barely slept. She said Daniel was facing pressure you cannot understand. Then she ended with a sentence I had seen in different forms for years. Families do not put each other in writing like this. I sat at my kitchen counter with oatmeal going cold in front of me and read that line twice. Families do not put each other in writing like this. No, what they meant was, Families like ours preferred to keep labor invisible and accountability verbal. They preferred conversations they could later reinterpret. They preferred late-night calls, partial context, implied obligation, and no record of who had asked for what. Writing was never the problem. Writing was the part they could not charm. I answered at 7:19 a.m. I am putting business-related conduct in writing because my name, professional judgment, and document history were used in a transaction after I was explicitly excluded from it. That is exactly the type of situation that requires written clarification. Then I made a second decision that mattered just as much as the first. I removed myself from everything, systematically. Not just Carson Ridge. Everything. I had spent years being the unofficial review desk for whatever financial, legal, contractual, insurance, property, licensing, or documentation issue drifted out of my family's life and landed in mine. Some requests came labeled as emergencies. Some came disguised as favors. Some arrived as photographs of forms with no explanation. Others came as, "Can you just glance at this?" followed by 3 hours of unpaid correction work. I opened a legal pad and wrote down every standing point of dependency I could think of. My father's refinancing tracker for the commercial building he still owned on Maple Avenue. The insurance renewal spreadsheet I maintained for 2 family-held LLCs. The vendor contact list Daniel used whenever he forgot who had quoted what. The archived lease files sitting in a cloud folder under my email access. The estate transfer checklist for my great-aunt Eleanor's property sale, which my mother had kept meaning to finish. A draft operating agreement for a small land parcel Daniel and a friend were still discussing developing. The annual property tax calendar reminders I had built for my parents because they once missed a deadline and blamed the county. There were more. Enough more that I had to start a second page. That was the moment the shape of it really came into focus. Carson Ridge was not a one-off abuse of trust. It was just the first place where the dependency had collided with a public dismissal at the wrong time. At 8:03 a.m., before leaving for work, I started sending formal notices, not dramatic messages, notices, to my father. Effective immediately, I am no longer maintaining or monitoring any calendars, filing reminders, draft revisions, document reviews, or communication support related to your business, property, financing, insurance, or entity records. Please assume no further action will be taken by me unless separately agreed in writing. To Daniel. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing from all document review, draft editing, file organization, due diligence support, lender communication assistance, entity paperwork review, and closing-related advisory work for any current or future transaction. Do not send me materials for comment or rely on prior templates bearing my edits. To my mother. Please do not forward forms, legal notices, property correspondence, or family administrative matters to me for interpretation or action. I will not be handling ongoing paperwork or communications on behalf of the family going forward. I copied no outsiders on those first notices because they were not yet about exposure. They were about boundary definition. Then I created a folder on my desktop called Withdrawal Record and saved everything into it by date. Email threads, voicemails, prior file requests, old attachments with my markup, calendar notes showing when I had stayed up late handling family issues. Screenshots of text messages asking for quick help that turned into entire work streams. I did not do it because I wanted a case. I did it because I finally understood the pattern clearly enough to know they would deny it later. And when someone has been benefiting from your invisible labor for years, they often tell the story backward the moment you stop. By 9:15 a.m., my phone had 11 missed calls, 6 from Daniel, 3 from my mother, 2 from my father. I answered none of them. At 9:28 a.m., Daniel emailed in all caps in the first line, which he only did when he wanted his panic to look like force. You are now affecting other deals. That phrase was useful. Other deals. I read the message carefully. He was not just angry about Carson Ridge anymore. He was worried that if I actually withdrew in a complete way, other ongoing matters would start surfacing without the quiet support I had been providing behind the scenes. I answered at 9:41 a.m. Please specify which deals you are referring to and whether my name, prior edits, or prior communications are currently being used in any active matter. He did not reply. That silence told me more than an answer would have. Around noon, my father sent what looked on the surface like a calmer note. Nina, this broad withdrawal is unnecessary and punitive. No one intended to misuse your name. We have all relied on each other at different times. I think you are reframing family cooperation as exploitation because you are upset. There was a time when a message like that would have pulled me back in. Not because it was true, but because it was just plausible enough to make me defend myself. That had always been the trap. Once I started explaining my motives, the original conduct disappeared, and suddenly the discussion became my tone, my timing, my sensitivity, my interpretation. Celeste had warned me about that, so I kept the reply factual. This is not punitive. It is corrective. If no misuse occurred, then formal withdrawal should create no issue beyond rerouting future responsibilities appropriately. Then I added one line that mattered. Please confirm whether any active business, property, financing, or legal matter currently contains my name, edits, contact information, or prior review language. He did not confirm. By 1:30 p.m., I was in my office reviewing a contract amendment for work when my direct line rang. The caller ID showed the law firm handling Carson Ridge. I answered because third parties tend to become more honest than family once delay starts costing money. The attorney was a woman named Priya Deshmukh. Crisp voice, no wasted phrasing. I had liked her from the start because she actually read what I sent. Ms. Mercer, I'm calling because I need to understand scope, she said. Okay. I now have 3 categories of concern. 1. Documents where your name appears as reviewer or certifying contact. 2. Documents that incorporate your prior language without final approval. 3. Communications in which counterparties were led to believe you remained involved after your withdrawal. Is that framing accurate? I wrote it down as she said it. Yes, I said. That framing is accurate. She paused briefly. There is a 4th concern. I waited. There are references to you in a side diligence log I received this morning from Daniel's broker. It appears your comments were being used to support unresolved representations even after you were removed from closing participation. I leaned back in my chair. Thank you for telling me. I felt you should know, she said. Because if this widens, the issue is no longer just sloppiness. It becomes reliance. There it was, the real word, reliance. That was what I had been carrying for them for years. Not emotional support, not family helpfulness, operational reliance, institutional reliance without title, pay, control, or acknowledgement. Priya continued, I need a direct answer for file purposes. Had you authorized continued use of your review history after Thursday evening? No. Had you approved final transaction documents? No. Were you aware your comments were still being represented as active support inside materials circulated Friday morning? No. She let that settle for a second. Understood, she said. I may need that restated by email. You'll have it within 10 minutes. After I hung up, I closed my office door and just sat there. Not because I was emotional, because precision has a cost, and in that moment, I could feel the entire architecture of the family story beginning to fail under the weight of exact language. For years, the family version had been simple. Daniel was the businessman. My father was the experienced one. My mother held things together emotionally. I was helpful with forms. But forms do not keep commercial transactions alive. Informal help does not generate lender confidence. A daughter who is good with paperwork does not become a source of unauthorized reliance by accident. What was collapsing was not just a deal, It was the mythology that my role had been optional. I sent Priya the confirmation email at 1:48 p.m. with a clean bullet list. Then I added a sentence I had not planned to write until that exact moment. To the best of my current knowledge, my name, prior comments, and document language may also remain embedded in other active family-related matters not yet disclosed to me. That sentence bought me something important later: space. It forced everyone reading it to confront the possibility that Carson Ridge was not isolated. At 3:05 p.m., my mother arrived at my office lobby unannounced. That was unlike her. My mother believed deeply in appearing composed in public. She did not like scenes, especially not in business settings, and she had never visited me at work without notice. That alone told me how much pressure was building. The receptionist called my extension and said, "There's a Linda Mercer here asking if you can step down for just a minute." I almost said no. Then I thought about witnesses. I took the elevator down. She was standing near the seating area with her purse clutched close to her body and the expression she wore when she wanted pity and authority at the same time. She smiled the second she saw me, but it disappeared quickly. "Can we talk in the car?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "We can talk here for 5 minutes." She looked around, uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort was information too. Her first move was maternal. "You look tired." "I'm at work." Her second move was injury. "Do you realize what kind of position this has put us in?" I kept my voice even. "Yes, a documented one." She blinked. "Nina, please do not talk to me like I'm one of your auditors." That sentence almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, because it was revealing. My standards were acceptable when they were protecting them, offensive when turned toward them. "I am speaking clearly," I said. "That is all." She lowered her voice. "Your father is beside himself. Daniel says the lender is asking questions that make it sound like he misrepresented things." I let that sit between us for a second. Did he? Her eyes widened slightly. "That is not fair." "It is direct." She crossed her arms. "You always do this. You make everything sound severe." "No," I said. "I describe things when no one else wants to." That silence told me more than anything she said next, because for 3 full seconds she did not deny it. Then she tried a different angle. "You know your brother is not as detail-oriented as you." "I know." "He trusts people." "He assumes people will absorb consequences for him," I said. "That is different." Her mouth tightened. "So this is about punishing him." "It is about ending access." She looked genuinely confused by that. Access had become so normal to them that revoking it felt personal. That is how entitlement often works in families. The competent person's limits feel like betrayal because everyone else has quietly reorganized around never needing consent. My mother softened her face and stepped closer. "You are still his sister." "Yes." "And your father is still your father." "Yes." "Then why are you acting like some outsider?" I read that question once in my head, then again, because the answer was the whole story. I'm acting like someone whose name was used when her actual presence became inconvenient, I said. "That should concern you more than my email tone." Her face changed then, not softer, colder. "You are making this family look dishonest." I held her gaze. "I am not making it look like anything." She left 2 minutes later without hugging me. She had not come for understanding. She had come to test whether I was bluffing. I was not. That evening, when I got home, I found 3 new emails and 1 voicemail from a commercial insurance broker I had worked with informally for my father months earlier. The voicemail was careful. "Hi, Nina. This is Mark Feldman. I'm calling because your father indicated you usually review renewal schedules for Mercer Holdings. We're against a deadline on the liability questionnaire, and I wanted to confirm which version is current." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Mercer Holdings was one of the LLCs connected to my father's remaining property. I had not touched its insurance forms in over 8 weeks. I had not agreed to review anything current. Yet here was a broker assuming I was still in the loop, because that assumption had likely been reinforced by someone in my family after my withdrawal. I documented the time, 6:18 p.m. Then I called Mark back. "This is Nina Mercer returning your call. I need to clarify that I am not reviewing or authorizing any current materials for Mercer Holdings. Effective this week, I have withdrawn from all family-related business support." He paused. "Oh, I was not aware of that. I assumed you were not. Your father said you were still helping on the administrative side." There it was. Not even 24 hours after asking me to think bigger than paperwork, they were still quietly pointing people toward me as if access remained intact. I kept my voice neutral. "That representation is no longer accurate. Please remove me as a contact and do not rely on prior review patterns as current authorization." "Understood," he said quickly. Then, more carefully, "Would you like that confirmed in writing?" "Yes." When the email came through 8 minutes later, I saved it directly into the withdrawal record folder. By then, I was no longer waiting to see whether the family would panic. They already were. What I was waiting to see was how wide the dependency went once every outside party started asking the same question. If Nina is no longer involved, who exactly has been holding all of this together? By Wednesday, the answer to that question had started reaching people my family could not charm. That was the point where panic changed shape. Up to then, Daniel had been angry, my mother had been wounded, and my father had been controlled. But once third parties began asking direct questions and expecting documented answers, the family moved into a different phase. The performance started failing in rooms with witnesses. At 8:11 a.m., I got an email from Priya, the attorney on Carson Ridge. Subject: urgent clarification requested before rescheduled closing discussion. She asked whether I would be available for a short call that afternoon if questions arose regarding document history, not to restore me to the transaction, but to clarify prior involvement if counterparties challenged the revision timeline. I read it once, then again. That request mattered because it showed how much of the file history ran through me even after I had been removed. It also gave me leverage I did not intend to misuse. I replied carefully, "I am available only to confirm the limits of my prior involvement and the date and scope of my withdrawal. I will not resume advisory or review functions." At 9:03 a.m., Daniel called from a number I did not know, which told me he was starting to improvise. I let it ring out. He followed with a text, "You are making this impossible." I answered in writing, "No, I am making it accurate." He called again at 9:17, then again at 9:21. Then my mother called at 9:24, my father at 9:30. I answered none of them. At 10:06 a.m., Greg the broker sent a message asking whether I would join a quick family-side alignment call. I declined. Alignment was one of those words people use when they mean pressure without a record. At 10:43 a.m., Priya forwarded a limited excerpt from the lender's inquiry list. It included a line that sat on the screen longer than the others. "Please identify who prepared diligence responses previously attributed to Nina Mercer and confirm whether those responses were independently validated after her removal from the matter." There it was, in plain language. Not, "Are they upset?" Not, "Can everyone calm down?" Not, "Is this just a family issue?" Who prepared it? Who validated it? What changed after I left? That is what real systems ask when informal arrangements stop feeling safe. I printed the message and added it to the folder I kept in my desk drawer at home. By then, the file was more than a folder. It was a record of a family learning, in stages, that my work had never been optional. It had only been unpaid. That afternoon, while I was finishing a compliance matrix for work, Daniel sent the first genuinely desperate email. It was longer than the others and much less polished. He said the lender was overreacting, the title company was becoming needlessly rigid, and outside parties were suddenly treating him like he had done something deceptive when all he had done was assume I would not jeopardize the deal over technical distinctions. Technical distinctions. I stared at that phrase for a full 10 seconds. Then I replied with one question. Was my name still being used after I withdrew? He responded 19 minutes later. That wasn't the point. I documented the time. 4:16 p.m. That was answer enough. On Thursday morning, Greg called again. This time I answered because his voicemail had contained one useful phrase. I think you should hear what is being said in the room. He sounded tired when I picked up. Nina, I'm going to keep this brief. Your brother is maintaining that everyone understood your involvement was informal. It was unpaid, I said, not informal. Yes, he said after a pause, that distinction is becoming clearer. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. He continued, the challenge now is that the file reflects a degree of reliance on your review patterns that was not disclosed as such. That has made the lender nervous. Nervous about what? That they were taking comfort from a layer of diligence that no longer exists and may not have been properly represented. I leaned back in my chair. In other words, they thought someone careful had looked at things. Another pause. Yes, and now they know that person is gone. Yes, I thanked him and ended the call. Not because I had nothing else to say, but because I finally understood something important. The collapse was no longer emotional, it was structural. Without me, no one could convincingly represent that the file had been properly cleaned, consistently tracked, or safely submitted. They could still close something, eventually, maybe, but they could not recreate history. They could not make my prior involvement mean less simply because my current involvement had ended. That evening, my father sent an email requesting a family meeting on Saturday at 2 p.m. at my parents' house. He wrote, "We need to speak privately and put this behind us." I read that line twice too. Put this behind us, meaning return this to the family version, where labor is invisible, records are impolite, and everyone agrees not to say the quiet part aloud. I answered, I will attend for 30 minutes. If there are documents to discuss, have them ready when I arrive. He did not respond. By Friday, I learned from Priya that Carson Ridge had not merely been delayed. The lender had suspended its current closing timeline pending re-review of the diligence file and buyer-side representations. One investor was asking whether the management structure had been overstated. The title company wanted reissued certifications. The Pharmacy Tenants Council had begun asking follow-up questions because the amendment packet had to be resent with corrected signature pages and supporting materials. Natural, slow, systematic consequences, not revenge, reality catching up. What mattered to me most was that no one could honestly say I caused those weaknesses. I had pointed to them. Then I stepped back. The weaknesses were already there. Saturday came with clear weather and the kind of quiet that makes people think difficult conversations might somehow become manageable if the sky looks normal enough. I arrived at my parents' house at 1:58 p.m., carrying a slim accordion file and a legal pad. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She had done her makeup carefully. That meant she wanted control. My father was already seated at the dining room table. Daniel stood near the kitchen island with his arms crossed, then uncrossed them when he saw the file in my hand. No one offered coffee. Good. I had not come for civility. On the table were 3 printed packets and 1 yellow notepad in my father's handwriting. I sat down and said, "What documents are we reviewing?" My mother flinched slightly. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Can you not do that?" he said. "Do what? Talk like this is some hearing." I placed my file on the table. If my name had not continued appearing where it should not have, we would not be here. My father lifted one hand in that calming gesture he used when he wanted to appear above the conflict. "Nina, We are here because this has gone too far. I let him finish before answering. It went too far when outside parties were allowed to rely on me after I was removed. Daniel stepped in before my father could continue. You are making it sound like I forged your signature. I didn't say that. You're implying fraud. I am describing unauthorized reliance. My mother made a low sound of frustration. This is exactly what I meant. You choose the harshest possible wording every time. I looked at her. No, I choose wording that survives review. That silence told me more than any argument they could have made, because even Daniel stopped moving for a second. My father slid one of the packets toward me. It was a draft chronology someone had prepared to explain the transaction delay in softer terms. It described me as a family advisor who had become temporarily unavailable due to internal disagreement over timing and role expectations. I read the sentence once, then again, then I slid it back. This is false. Daniel gave a tired laugh. It's not false, it's just less inflammatory. No, I said, it is false. I did not become unavailable. I withdrew after discovering my name remained in use after I was told I was not needed. That sequence matters. My father's jaw tightened. Do you hear yourself? Yes. Do you hear what this sounds like to other people? Yes. He leaned forward. It sounds like you are trying to humiliate your brother. There it was again, their preferred theory, that a woman refusing hidden labor must be motivated by emotion, punishment, exposure, bitterness, anything except accuracy. I opened my accordion file and placed 3 documents on the table. First, Daniel's text from 8:17 p.m. telling me I would not be needed at the closing. Second, my withdrawal email from 10:06 p.m. with the affected file list attached. Third, the follow-up confirmation from the insurance broker stating my father had told him I was still helping on the administrative side after my withdrawal. I aligned the pages carefully. No, I said, I am trying to stop being used in absentia. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel said, more quietly, I thought you were overreacting. I didn't think they would make such a big issue out of it. That was the first honest sentence he had said in days. I held his gaze. You didn't think they would ask the same questions I ask. He looked away first. My mother steps in again, but her voice had changed, less offended, more tired. You could have handled this with us first. I answered her directly. I did, for years. She started to say something, then stopped, because that was the part no one at the table could really deny. They had all benefited from the same pattern for too long. My father straightened the papers in front of him, not because they needed straightening, but because he needed his hands occupied. What is it you want now? It was the first useful question anyone had asked. I took out one final sheet and placed it on the table. It was a short, printed statement, not legal, not theatrical, just clear. As of September 9th, I have permanently withdrawn from all unpaid family business, property, financing, insurance, documentation, and transaction support. My name, credentials, language, prior comments, templates, and contact information are not to be used, implied, referenced, or relied upon in any current or future matter without my explicit written consent. Any prior assumption of availability is terminated. Daniel stared at it. My father did not touch it. My mother read the first line and said softly, "Permanently?" "Yes." "And that's it?" Daniel asked. "You're just done?" "With this role," I said. "Yes." He gave a brittle laugh. "Over one deal?" "No," I said, "after many years." That silence told me more than his answer ever could have, because he knew it was true. My father finally spoke. "You are making a very large decision in a moment of anger." I shook my head. This is the first decision I've made here without anger being part of it. Then I stood up. No speech, no scene, no slam chair. I put the extra copy of the statement on the table, closed my file, and said, "Do not send me materials. Do not list me as a contact. Do not tell people I'm still helping. If anything remains in circulation with my name on it, remove it." My mother looked at me like she wanted me to soften the edges before I left. I did not. I walked out at 2:27 p.m. Daniel called that night at 8:41. I did not answer. My father called Sunday morning at 9:06. I did not answer. Monday brought the first real confirmation of collapse. Carson Ridge was no longer simply delayed. One investor had paused funding participation. The lender requested a revised internal responsibility schedule. The title company would not proceed without fresh certifications and clarified document provenance. Greg left a voicemail saying, "Carefully, I think the parties are reassessing whether the buyer side is ready for this asset." Reassessing whether the buyer side is ready, which was a professional way of saying what I had known for months. They had mistaken my quiet competence for a permanent utility. And now the system was showing them the difference between support and structure. Once the reassessment started, the consequences came exactly the way most real consequences do, not all at once, not dramatically, one requirement at a time, one email at a time, one person quietly declining to move forward until something basic could be explained. Carson Ridge did not implode in a single afternoon. It thinned out. The investor from Charlotte reduced his commitment first. Greg told me that indirectly in a voicemail I had not asked for and did not return. He said the investor wanted clearer governance and more confidence in operational readiness. I wrote the phrases down anyway because they mattered. Clearer governance, more confidence in operational readiness. Both were polished ways of saying the same thing. No one trusted Daniel to manage a file that had already shown signs of borrowed credibility. The lender came next. Priya informed me, in one last informational email I had not requested but appreciated, that the credit committee had moved the transaction into a higher scrutiny lane. They wanted revised diligence summaries, updated source of funds explanations, reissued certifications, and direct confirmation of who was responsible for post-closing compliance tracking. Without those items, no new date would be set. Then the seller's side started losing patience, not because of me, because delays cost money, and people who actually do this work for a living tend to notice when a buyer's internal structure is more image than process. By the second week of October, Carson Ridge was effectively gone. The seller accepted a different offer from a smaller group with cleaner financing and, from what I later heard, far less storytelling attached to it. Daniel blamed the lender. My father blamed the attorney. My mother blamed how ugly things had gotten. No one blamed the fact that they had built a major transaction around invisible labor they neither respected nor properly disclosed. That part remained too close to the truth. The interesting thing is that once Carson Ridge fell away, the rest of the family system did not recover. It kept showing its weak points because I was no longer there to absorb them. The Mercer Holdings insurance renewal went out late and at a higher premium because the liability questionnaire had to be redone without the neat summary language I used to prepare. My father missed a filing reminder tied to one of the LLC annual reports and had to pay reinstatement fees. Daniel sent the wrong vendor packet to a contractor on a smaller office project and then spent 3 weeks undoing a payment dispute that would have taken me 40 minutes to prevent. Again, not revenge, reality. If a system works only because one person is quietly carrying the precision, then removing that person does not destroy the system. It reveals it. The calls kept coming for about 6 weeks. They moved through predictable stages. First, anger. Daniel accusing me of being rigid, self-righteous, impossible. My mother saying I was tearing the family apart over paper. My father insisting I was letting professional habits poison personal relationships. Then negotiation. Could I just review one insurance form? Could I just glance at one lender package? Could I just explain one tax notice? Because you know how these things are written. Then desperation. A broker needing clarification. A contractor asking who now handled records. My mother forwarding a probate letter marked urgent. Daniel texting at 10:52 p.m., "Please just tell me if this language is a problem." I answered all of it the same way. "I am not reviewing family materials. Please direct this through appropriate paid counsel or administrative support." At first, that response felt cold even to me. Then it started feeling clean. There is a difference. Around that same time, I made one of the healthiest decisions of my adult life. I stopped measuring my boundaries by whether my family thought they were fair. I had spent years trying to find the exact tone that would make other people accept limits without resentment. There isn't one. People who benefit from your over-availability often experience any limit as injury, no matter how carefully it is phrased. Once I understood that, I got quieter. Not harder, just quieter. I still spoke to my mother occasionally, but only about neutral things at first. Her garden, my aunt's knee surgery, a recipe she had asked my cousin for. We did not discuss business. We did not discuss Carson Ridge. Every time she tested the boundary with, "Since I have you, can I ask about this notice?" I answered the same way. "No, I'm not the right person for that anymore." My father did not speak to me for nearly 3 months. That silence was not accidental. It was a withholding strategy. He believed distance would make me uncomfortable enough to come back in and restore normal function. In the past, it might have worked. This time, it did not. In December, he finally invited me to lunch. I almost declined. Then I thought about closure. We met at a quiet diner halfway between his office and my apartment. He looked older than he had in September. Not broken, just less certain that his old methods still worked. He talked about the weather first, then traffic, then some local rezoning debate. I let him finish. Eventually, he put his coffee down and said, "I suppose you think you proved your point." I remember looking at the sugar packet beside my plate and deciding, in that exact second, not to defend myself anymore. "I didn't have a point to prove," I said. "I had a role to stop." He watched me for a long moment. "You always make things sound final." "Yes," I said, "when they are." That silence told me more than anything else he said over the next hour. Because underneath all his language about family strain and embarrassment and bad timing was one simple fact he could not quite say aloud. He had expected continued access, not discussion, not consent, access. By the end of lunch, he admitted one thing clearly, and it mattered because it was the closest anyone in my family ever came to naming the pattern. "We relied on you too much," he said. Not an apology, but true. I nodded once. Yes. He looked down at the table. You could have said no sooner. There it was, the final family defense. The person who carries too much is somehow responsible for other people's decision to keep loading weight onto them. "I should have," I said. "And now I have." We paid separately. That mattered to me more than it probably should have. By January, my life had started feeling larger in quiet ways. I slept better. My weekends opened up. My phone stopped carrying that low-grade dread that comes from seeing a family member's name and knowing it means unpaid labor dressed as urgency. I had money saved by then, not dramatic money, but disciplined money. For years, I had been sending extra payments into a someday house account while helping everyone else preserve their own timelines. Once the family obligations stopped eating my evenings and attention, I turned toward my own plan with real consistency. In February, I met with a mortgage advisor. In March, I got pre-approved. In April, I toured a townhouse on the north side of Raleigh with a small office, plain white walls, good light in the kitchen, and a narrow patch of backyard just large enough for 2 chairs and a few planters. It was not flashy, it was not aspirational in the way my father liked things to be aspirational. It was solid, manageable, mine. I closed in May. The signing took 43 minutes. I read every page before I signed it, which made the closing attorney smile and say, "You'd be surprised how few people do that." I smiled back and said, "I wouldn't." When I got the keys, I sat in my car for a full minute before turning the ignition. Not crying, just letting the feeling arrive in a complete way. There is something very different about building your own stability after spending years functioning as borrowed stability for other people. It feels quieter than triumph, cleaner than revenge, heavier at first, then lighter. I bought a desk for the small office and a deep green chair for the corner by the window. I planted rosemary and basil outside. I learned the sound the back gate made in the wind. I stopped apologizing for not being constantly available, and I did help one family member after all, though not through the family. My great-aunt Eleanor, the one whose property transfer I had once quietly organized, called me directly in June. She was 81 by then, recently widowed, and embarrassed to admit that she did not understand a set of long-term care billing notices she had started receiving. She did not flatter me, she did not manipulate me, she simply said, "I don't want to ask the others. They turn everything into tension. Could you tell me what this means?" Yes, I could. Because that was different. Need without entitlement is different. Respect is different. Directness is different. I drove out to see her on a Saturday with my laptop and a notepad. We sat at her dining table for 3 hours. I called the billing office, got the itemization corrected, helped her apply for a program she qualified for, and organized her files into a binder with tabs she could actually use. Before I left, she touched my wrist and said, "Thank you for helping me without making me feel foolish." I thought about that sentence all the way home. Without making me feel foolish. That was the kind of usefulness I still wanted in my life. Chosen, clear, human, not extracted. My relationship with my mother eventually settled into something cautious but more honest than before. She stopped sending documents. I stopped stepping into silences to repair what no one had named. We talked every couple of weeks. Sometimes we even had pleasant conversations. Daniel and I became cordial in the way adults sometimes do when closeness is no longer healthy, but open war feels unnecessary. He once asked if I would ever work with him again on anything business-related. I said no. He nodded like he had expected that, and to his credit, he did not ask again. My father took the longest. He still prefers stories where he remains practical and misunderstood. I no longer feel any need to interrupt those stories unless they reach for me. That is another kind of freedom. The lesson I took from all of it was not that family cannot be trusted. It was more specific than that. Usefulness and worth are not the same thing. Being needed is not the same as being respected. Being relied on is not the same as being loved. And being good at carrying weight does not mean the weight is yours. For a long time, I thought boundaries would cost me belonging. What they actually cost me was my role in an arrangement that had been mistaken for belonging. That turned out to be a much smaller loss than I feared. If you are the one in your family who keeps the record straight, remembers the deadlines, answers the confusing letters, catches the missing signatures, and quietly prevents other people's bad habits from becoming disasters, then you probably already know how easy it is for that role to become your identity. It is not your identity. It is a function. It can end. And if the system collapses when you step back, that does not mean you failed it. It means you were holding more than anyone admitted. So that is what happened. I did not ruin my brother's deal. I did not embarrass my father. I did not abandon my family over paperwork. I stopped letting my protection be treated as property. And once I did, the rest of them had to meet the reality they had been hiding behind for years. If you have ever had to learn the difference between being valued and being used, tell me where you are watching from and leave one word in the comments. Enough.